Hey everybody! So we've already learnt about the basic structure of DNA, and we've learnt that DNA has the double helix structure, and we can think of it like a twisted up ladder, because the pairs of bases go between they're the rungs of the ladder, and they go between the supports of the ladder, which we call the backbone. But for this video, we're going to go right into detail about the actual molecules that make up the DNA molecule itself. And DNA is called a macromolecule because it's so large and because it's made up of so many smaller molecules all joined together. So DNA is a macromolecule. Alright, well, here's the 6 main building blocks that DNA is made from. Firstly, we'll start with the actual bases because they're the ones we've learnt about already. So here we have our 4 bases. We've got adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And their full name is nitrogenous base. Nitrogenous base because the molecules have so many nitrogen atoms as part of the molecule. So you can see here adenine, it's got 5 different nitrogen molecules, which is a lot for an organic molecule. So our 4 nitrogenous bases, they're also split up into what's called the purines and the pyrimidines. The purines you can see are adenine and guanine, and they have 2 rings in their structure, whereas the pyrimidines, which are thymine and cytosine, they only have 1 ring in their structure. And that's important when it comes to which molecules join together and pair up in the DNA. Okay, the next building block that makes up DNA is a phosphate molecule. So phosphate, remember, has the chemical symbol PO4, and it's an ion. It actually has a 3 negative charge. But for now, we just need to know that it contains a phosphorus atom in the middle, and it contains oxygens as well. And it's basically a round, an overall round shape. The final building block that makes up DNA is the sugar, and this is where DNA gets part of its name from. And we have deoxyribose sugar. So it's called deoxyribose because there's another sugar called ribose, and we'll meet that in a second. But you can see it's a sugar molecule that has a ring structure as well. And importantly, the two different areas of the molecule are named. One's called the 5 prime. This dash means prime. And the other part of the molecule is called 3 prime. And that's important because that's how we name the different ends of a DNA molecule. And it's how we explain where a gene starts and ends. So we'll talk about more of that later. So from those building blocks, the next level up in organization is called the nucleotide. And the nucleotide is like one of the main building blocks of DNA, and it's called a monomer. And monomer just means it's a building block that joins together to make a larger molecule. Okay, so we can see that in a nucleotide, we've got the phosphate group joins onto the deoxyribose sugar, and then you have a base joined to the top corner here. So the phosphate and the sugar are always the same in a nucleotide. But obviously the base can change depending on which of our 4 nitrogenous bases we have. So there's 4 possible bases that can be in the nucleotide, which means there's 4 different nucleotides that can build up DNA. Okay, so let's zoom out again to the next level up. And when several different nucleotides join together, that's how we start making a long strand of DNA. So here we've got 4 nucleotides joined together. And we can see there's 1 here, 2, 3, and the 4th one down here. And each one of these nucleotides is different because it has a different base attached to it. We've got thymine, guanine, cytosine, and adenine. Okay. So we can see that the backbone, what we used to call the backbone, it's actually made up of alternating phosphates and then sugars, because this phosphate is joined to this sugar as part of the same nucleotide, and then that joins to the next phosphate of the next nucleotide, and then sugar, and then so on. So the technical name we call the backbone of DNA is the sugar phosphate backbone. Because of those alternating molecules that make up the backbone. And that's this dark area here highlighted. And then the inner part where the bases are attached, they're the rungs of the ladder, which we learnt about earlier. But this is only just one strand of DNA. So this is a single-stranded DNA. But as we know, DNA is a double-stranded molecule. So let's zoom out again. So here's our single strand, just as more of a cartoon view. And then we've got the proper view of DNA, which shows that it's actually double-stranded, or 2 strands joined together. And as we know, those strands twist up into the double helix to make our proper structure of DNA. Alright. Well, I mentioned how we name the ends of DNA before. So let's go back to this view here. So remember how in the deoxyribose sugar, the top carbon up here is called 5'. And in DNA, that's always going to have a phosphate attached to it. So the end of a DNA molecule with a phosphate attached is the 5' end. So the 5' end, is the phosphate end of the DNA. And if we look all the way down at the bottom, the sort of exposed part of the molecule is the 3' end of the sugar. So we call this the 3' end of the strand. So it's the sugar end, or it's sometimes called the hydroxy end, because this chemical group here of OH is called the hydroxyl group. An oxygen added to a hydrogen. Okay. So there are a couple more concepts to do with DNA. The first one is that our original view of DNA actually isn't quite right, because scientists discovered that actually the two strands join up in opposite directions. So the first strand that we looked at, it has 5' at the top, where the phosphate is, and it has its 3' end at the bottom, but the opposite strand runs the other way. So if we have 5 to 3 running this way, the opposite strand, or the complementary strand, has 5' at the bottom, going up to 3' at the top. And the way that these two strands join is called anti-parallel. There goes my speaker turning off. Anti-parallel just means that they're parallel, but they're running in opposite directions. Parallel, but running in opposite directions. Okay. So that's the structure of DNA down to the molecular level. But we also need to compare that to RNA. So the last little bit we'll look at the comparison. Firstly, remember that RNA is different because it has the base uracil instead of thymine. And RNA is only single-stranded, whereas DNA was double-stranded. And there's one more difference as well that we haven't talked about, and it's to do with the sugar that builds the nucleotides. So here is a DNA nucleotide. Remember, they're the building blocks. DNA nucleotides, they have deoxyribose sugar, but RNA molecules, they have ribose sugar. So there's three main differences. RNA is single-stranded, it has uracil instead of thymine, and its nucleotides are made of ribose instead of deoxyribose. But they're still made up of nucleotides all stacked on top of each other to make the strand of RNA. Okay, that is the structure of DNA.